Hi, I'm Riley,
Hi, I'm Destiny.
and today we will be presenting on human trafficking among Black women and children. Today we will guide you through three main sections of this presentation. First, we will explore the definition of sociology and its importance in addressing societal issues. Next, we will dive into the crisis of human trafficking among Black women and children, examining its causes and impacts. Finally, we will present a sociological analysis of this crisis through three key paradigms: functionalism, conflict theory, and interactionism.
Sociology is a scientific study of society, focusing on patterns of relationships, interactions, and culture. As Karl Marx stated, it provides interpretive understanding of social action to explain societal dynamics. It also bridges the personal and systemic, what C. Wright Mills calls connecting personal troubles with public issues. Sociology focuses on the interplay between individuals and larger societal forces. For instance, it helps explain why certain groups, like Black women and children, are unfairly targeted for trafficking due to systemic vulnerabilities. Relevance to social sciences. So, psychology, which reveals the internal scars and the importance of tailored mental health interventions. Economics, which highlights the external pressures of poverty and the need for systemic economic change. And political science, that underscores the role of structure reforms and advocacy in combating trafficking and its roots. For example, studies show that poverty creates economic desperation, making individuals susceptible to traffickers' false promises. Without sociological insights, policies might ignore these root causes, focusing only on criminal enforcement rather than prevention.
Human trafficking is a modern form of slavery where people are exploited through force, fraud, or coercion for purposes like sex, labor, or forced servitude. It is a serious crime that violates human rights and impacts millions of people around the world. Victims are often trapped in these situations, and traffickers profit from their suffering. Black women and children are particularly vulnerable to trafficking, both globally and in the United States. Data shows that they are overrepresented in trafficking cases here in the United States, largely due to systemic racism and economic disadvantages. Sociological research highlights how human trafficking is deeply connected to systemic failures such as inadequate social services, economic inequality, and racial discrimination, which create conditions that unfairly affect marginalized groups, particularly Black women and children. Limited access to quality education, housing, and healthcare leaves individuals without the support systems needed to resist or recover from exploitation, while foster care and welfare programs are often failing to provide stability. Historical and systemic racism has contributed to disparities in economic opportunities and legal protections for Black communities, leaving them more exposed to traffickers who deliberately target those in precarious situations. These systemic inequalities not only make it easier for traffickers to manipulate and control their victims, but also hinder public concern and institutional responses, underscoring the need to address root causes and strengthen protective support sources.
So, every 30 seconds, someone becomes a victim of human trafficking. A grim reminder of global crisis. Although Black women and children represent only 7.2% of U.S. population, they account for 40% of confirmed trafficking cases, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. Despite these statistics, Black girls are being to harsher treatment, which particularly address the widespread issue of human trafficking that heavily impacts Black women and children. The vulnerabilities, which are created by deep-rooted racial and gender inequalities, not only worsen the risk of trafficking, but also call attention to the urgent need for comprehensive reforms in order to protect these vulnerable populations. On this next clip, we'll be sharing a quick video just to talk about more how Black women and children are affected with human trafficking.
Discuss this is the film. This is the film.
Functionalism views society as a system of interdependent parts where problems like trafficking arise from structural dysfunctions. Each part of a society plays a specific function that contributes to the overall stability of society. Each part of society plays a specific function, and one part of the system can impact the other parts, potentially leading to social instability. For example, weak child welfare services often leave young Black girls exposed to traffickers, perpetuating societal instability. Poverty creates conditions where individuals may be vulnerable to exploitation, including trafficking, as people seek desperate means of survival. Economic instability can push people, particularly marginalized groups, into situations of vulnerability where trafficking networks exploit them. Education gaps also, lack of access to education and inequality in educational opportunities limit individuals' life choices and opportunities, making them more susceptible to trafficking. The inability to secure well-paying jobs due to inadequate education can drive individuals to exploitative situations. Weak social safety nets or inadequate support systems, such as child welfare, mental health services, and domestic violence prevention, leave vulnerable individuals without protection from trafficking.
Okay, so we have conflict theory. It examines power struggles and systemic inequalities. So we have economic exploitation, which highlights how social, economic, and political inequalities contribute to the vulnerability of populations, especially Black women and children, to exploitation through human trafficking. These groups often face poverty, lack access to education, discrimination, and inadequate social support systems. Racism creates additional barriers for Black women and children, limiting their access to resources and justice, and making them easy targets for trafficking. Gender discrimination places women and children, particularly Black women and children, in vulnerable positions where they are more likely to be exploited sexually or economically through trafficking. For example, traffickers exploit the perception that crimes against Black victims carry less legal consequence, a stark reflection of systemic injustice.
Interactionist perspective. So interactionism focuses on the day-to-day interactions between individuals and how societal perceptions shape identities and experiences. This perspective emphasizes the power of social labels and their influence on survivors. Labeling theory suggests that the labels society assigns to individuals significantly impact their self-perception and how others treat them. In the context of human trafficking, survivors are often mislabeled as criminals or willing participants rather than victims of exploitation. These harmful labels perpetuate stigma, making it harder for survivors to access justice, support services, or even acceptance in their communities. For example, survivors of sex trafficking may be treated as offenders in the legal system due to societal biases rather than being offered the protection they need. On a micro level, the interactions survivors have with law enforcement, healthcare providers, and social workers are often influenced by these societal labels. Research shows that survivors frequently avoid seeking help because of the fear of being judged, disbelieved, or criminalized. This fear is particularly pronounced for Black women and children who face compounded discrimination due to racial and gender biases. Stigma not only impacts individual survivors, but also affects their communities, creating a cycle of silence and inaction. Survivors who internalize these labels may struggle with feelings of shame and isolation, which can hinder their recovery and reintegration into society. Meanwhile, societal reluctance to recognize trafficking victims such as undermines collective efforts to address issues collectively.
So next we have sociological insights and call to action. From a conflict theory perspective, human trafficking among Black women and children is driven by systemic inequalities in power and resources. To combat this, we must challenge poverty, racism, and classism to advocate for equitability, resource distribution and education, and end institutional racism and sexism that perpetuate marginalization. From a structural functionalism perspective, strengthening social institutions like family, education, and welfare systems is key to protecting vulnerable groups. Prevention efforts should focus on education and equitable access to resource, fostering integration to reduce susceptibility to exploitation. From an interactionalist perspective, changing public perceptions and societal attitudes is vital. Education and community initiatives can combat trafficking by reducing the stigma, empowering individuals, and creating supportive environments where survivors can seek help without fear of discrimination. I have a quote from C. Wright Mills. We must challenge systemic inequalities through education, advocacy, and policy reforms.
Human trafficking is not inevitable. It is an extreme violation of human rights that is deeply rooted in systemic inequalities that impact society. By promoting community education, enhancing access to essential social services, and supporting policies that combat discrimination, society can help disrupt the cycles of poverty and exploitation that fuel human trafficking. Increasing public awareness is crucial to challenging stereotypes, reducing victim blaming, and fostering understanding, particularly among marginalized groups like Black women and children. Providing trauma-informed and culturally sensitive services is essential to supporting victims, ensuring they have the access to legal, medical, and psychological care to aid in recovery. Strengthening laws to protect victims and hold traffickers accountable, alongside implementing policies that prioritize victim support over criminalization, are the steps towards creating a more just and supportive system for those impacted by trafficking. The fight against human trafficking must prioritize the experiences of Black women and children, making sure that they receive the recognition, support, and protection they deserve as they seek safety and justice. Thank you. And here are the references that we used for this presentation.
Thank you.